and welcome to the Atma Paradigm webinar series. This is the Atma Paradigm, and we are continuing the first part of our course, which is on consciousness. So, the Atma Paradigm, consciousness-based science, and I'm the presenter. My name is Kandari Das. We continue with part one, consciousness, and we start with a very quick summary from what we did last week. We asked the question, what can we know for certain? And what we were exploring were the intuitive, what are sometimes called the pre-philosophical aspects of consciousness. Sorry, I hadn't made my appearance yet. So we did a few little exercises, kind of thought experiments, just to establish a kind of starting point for our exploration of this mystery of consciousness. We looked at the idea of our sense of existence, our sense of being a unified individual person. We looked at our ability to experience the world and our status as the subject of our experience, i.e. that we are the witness and the observer of things that are happening through our bodies, that we experience through the senses and within our mind. And we are the same witness throughout our whole life. And then I raised a statement by Professor John Searle, who gave this point, that the essential trait of consciousness that we need to explain is unified qualitative subjectivity. I tried to unpack that phrase a little bit, and we started with subjectivity, meaning that there is an I, myself, I am the subject of my experiences, and that there is a sense of unified consciousness, i.e. that I am the sole, singular, unchanging and complete entity who is the subject. And then there's the word qualitative. And this we didn't explain last week, but we're going to dedicate the entire of this week's course just to understanding this particular point, qualitative. What are we talking about? And it introduces perhaps a new word to many of you, this word qualia. Now, there's a little logo at the bottom here, which means we've got one of our online polls if you've got access to the Facebook page. And the question is very simply, have you heard of this term before? And even if you've heard of it, do you know what it means? So take a moment just to say yes, no, or even perhaps. So qualia, we're going to explore the meaning of this word. And we have said that it's really important, because it is at the crux of what is called the hard problem of consciousness. And I'll explain where that term came from and why it applies. We're not going to address all the answers to qualia or consciousness in this class. Really, what we need to do today is to make sure that each of us fully understand the significance of qualia and why they are important to the discussion on consciousness. And basically we'll be making the point that unless you have an explanation for how and why we experience qualia, you have not got an explanation to consciousness. It is that crucial. So we start like this. The proverbial red ball, as they tend to use by philosophers. So we're able to experience, and I want you to absorb yourself in the experience of this red ball. What is it like to experience it? Its roundness, that's your experience of its shape, and also about its colour, its redness. There's something that it is like to experience this redness. Now, please note that when I'm talking about what it is like to experience the redness, I'm not asking you to think about how it affects you psychologically. We often say red is a warm colour, but feeling warmth from the experience of redness, it's not what we're talking about here. We're really just talking about the redness, pure and simple, the experience of what it is like to just to get redness. And it's different to what we would experience from this ball, the blueness. So there is a distinction in the quality of our experience. In one, we will experience redness, and in the other, we're experiencing blueness. Now, Thomas Nagel, a famous philosopher, he was very interested in what it was like to be a bat. We're not really going to explore that here. I just introduce it because that's how he's known in, that's what probably made his name in terms of the philosophy of mind. But he raised a nice phrase that is kind of helpful for getting into the subject of qualia. He says there is a what it is likeness aspect in every experience. So when we see a red ball, there is a what it is like to experience that redness. There is something that it is like to experience the redness of red. And it's happening inside our heads. So redness and blueness, these are examples of qualia, specific qualia related to our visual experience. Now, what do we mean by qualia exactly? What are they? Well, the term originally is derived from Latin. It's not an exact Latin term itself, but it's kind of derived from it. And the word qualia is in plural. So there is a singular form which is quale. But most of the time you'll hear people talking about it in plural because it's the plural of them. It's a fact that they're not just one singular thing, they are everything we experience, which makes them problematic. And the word qualia relates to the English word qualities. And I'll explain that for you in a moment. But first, let's have a little look at the history of qualia. This is Dr. David Chalmers. And we met with Stuart Hameroff, who runs the Center for Consciousness Studies in Tucson. And every other year he runs a conference there, the Science of Consciousness Conference. And in 1994, he was running the conference, and he explained it to me that, so I can say it like this, that the conference kicked off and there was a couple of speakers just talking about behaviorism and philosophy of mind, and it was rather boring and unexciting. Then up steps to the podium Dr. David Chalmers. Now, he was a little younger at the time. In fact, he looked like this, with long flowing hair. He's Australian, and he really captured the audience, because what he did was to warn all these people talking about consciousness that they were forgetting the most important aspect of what we mean by consciousness. And really what he was saying is the hard problem is explaining the subjective experience of qualia. And he's credited with this phrase, the hard problem. And we'll talk about that at the end of this talk, as we have reached the point when we're able to justify why this is the hard problem. But for now, we need to understand why the whole science and philosophical community were chastened. And since then, it has become clear that unless you've got an explanation for the subjective experience of qualia, you haven't got an idea of what's going on in consciousness. That becomes its challenge. So I mentioned qualia relates to qualities. And which qualities? The qualities of what? It's the qualities of all our inner experiences, the qualities of all of our mental content. Now, what does that mean? And how do we get our head around it? And I must say that it's very difficult to try and explain and convey everything that is involved with qualia, and just to kind of understand what on earth we are talking about. Because for so long we have taken for granted how we experience the world. And let me show you what I mean by that. That here might be, here's this guy and he's looking out at the world and he sees a beautiful flower, a rose. So when he looks at the rose, what does he have in his mind? He sees a picture. And this is the interesting thing, that when we look out in the world, we see something, we see a picture in our heads. Now you might think, well, that's kind of obvious. The world is picturesque. It's full of, I can look out my window, I can see some trees and a little road. You can see some cows kind of moving around. These things are out there, so it's no wonder you see them. But wait a minute. We really got to question. The rose is somewhere distant from this person who's looking at it. Yes, light is coming from it, but that light's going into the eye, it's being converted into electricity, it's going into the brain. Why, if all our brain has got is electricity, why am I seeing that electricity as a picture? And this is what we have to really get our heads around. That we are experiencing something in a very different format to what it is in the brain. Why on earth do we see the world as a picture? And just to say, well, that's because you've got eyes, and that's not the explanation. And we'll really take that apart, particularly next week when we look at the whole neuroscience of this that's behind this. But for now, you just have to think about the wonder and the strangeness of the fact that when light comes into your eyes and is turned into electricity, you experience that in your mind as a picture. Now you might say, no, I'm not experiencing it in my mind, I'm experiencing it from my eyes. Your eyes aren't conscious. Your eyes are just a little bit of biological machinery like a camera. So they're not experiencing the picture. And your brain is just more circuitry. It's not experiencing the picture. Where is this picture? And how is that picture emerging from what's happening in the brain? This is at the heart of the problem of qualia. Now, it probably will take a little longer to really get this to sink in, the mystery of this. So let's talk a bit more about what we mean by qualia and different types of qualia. In a lot of the literatures that you will read on qualia, they will really talk about qualia as the qualities of the our impressions raised from the sensory inputs. So, for instance, light coming through our eyes, we see a picture, and there's a vibration in the air, it enters our ears, we hear a sound. Similar problem. We eat an ice cream and there is some chemical activity going on with the chemicals in our mouth and our taste buds, but we experience that as a flavor. Or we smell a flower, and although some chemicals are going into our brain, we're still actually not quite sure exactly how they lock into different receptors in our nose. But even so, all that's been sent to the brain is another electrical signal, but that one we experience as a fragrance. Or touch. Again, a little message sent from the nerves up to the brain, but we experience that as softness perhaps, or as hardness. So we have different senses. They are picking up information about the world, but in each case, they're sending that information to the brain in the form of electrical signals. But we are experiencing each of them in very, very different ways. Different from each other and different from the format of the data and information as it is contained within the brain, within the neural circuitry. That's the wonder of it all. And it doesn't just stop with sensory perceptions. There's also what they call internal sensations. There's kind of hunger and thirst, things that your body is telling you. there is something that it is like to feel hungry. You all know that, and I'm probably setting you off at this moment. There's also something that is like to feel happy, or to feel fearful and worried. And there's also, and this one's a big one, there's something that it is like to feel pain. Now, you might have thought, well, pain surely is so well understood in biology and medicine. You know, we've got pain relief, we've got anesthetics, we've got analgesics, we kind of know what to do with pain. We know how to stop it. But the interesting thing is, although we can point to the various C fibers within our brain that are firing, which seem to be related to maybe a particular injury, we're not able to explain why we experience that particular electrical activity as an ow. Ouch, that hurt. I felt that. I was conscious of the pain of it. There was a funny story about one philosopher who goes to the antenatal clinic with his wife when they were expecting their first kid. And the facilitator of the class asked them, so what is pain? And the philosopher thought, oh, I know this one. I've got all the answers. I've studied neuroscience, and I can explain the physiology that's going on. And he said he was very chastened to hear the actual answer that the facilitator wanted and established. And he said, basically, pain is whatever she says it is. And that's actually correct. That's not just a compromise. That is actually the truth of the matter. That pain is what we feel it to be. We know that one can have damage to parts of their organ and still not feel it. So therefore there's no pain. Or we can feel pain maybe when there doesn't seem to be any damage. And if we don't feel a pain, there is no pain. So pain is a felt sensation. There are other types of qualia and thoughts and ideas. Now this one is not so broadly discussed or even accepted among some philosophers, because they would really like to limit the amount of things going on in our heads that have qualia, because the visual stuff and the sensory stuff's hard enough, never mind extending qualia to the experience of our thoughts and ideas. But there is something that it is like to experience a thought, say particularly like a desire or a worry. There is something that is like even just to get a thought in your mind. Even your thoughts come to you in kind of, it's a form of dialogue that you're hearing, isn't it? We each have a kind of inner monologue going on inside our head. That there is something that is like to hear that. And actually in psychology they've now demonstrated that even your thoughts speak to you in a particular accent that you can recognize. I'll talk about that in another class, because there was a very cute experiment they did to prove that point. So qualia exist even in thoughts. There is a what it is likeness within them. However, for the purpose of this particular talk, I'm going to focus specifically on the qualia linked to visual experience. And I do that because I think it's the simplest way in for us. So, qualia, I'm going to give you several features of qualia and give some demonstrations of it. First thing to recognize about qualia, they're real. Now, what do we mean by that? They're real. In fact, they're the only thing that you have ever experienced in your life. They are that real. You cannot point to anything that you have ever experienced that are not the qualia of your thoughts, knowledge, ideas, impressions of the world. Everything is explained by qualia. When you look out at the world, all you're experiencing are the qualities, say, related to visual experience. You're experiencing shapes, colors and movement. And really movement is just the change of shapes and colors. So qualia are real. They're what you experience. there's an interesting point to make that qualia are not subconscious stuff in the mind. Because if something is subconscious, and it's certainly true that our senses are feeding us so much information at every moment, and only a fraction of that are we actually conscious of. And it's the part that we are conscious of that we are experiencing the qualities of those experiences. So at the moment, for instance, your eyes may be looking clearly at the screen in front of you, paying full attention to what's going on here. And you may not be noticing what's going on in your periphery. That light is entering your eye, it is being processed, but you're not aware of it. So qualia are related to what you actually experience. And in that way, they are phenomenal. And when I say phenomenal, I don't really mean they're awesome, although you could say that they are, but they are perceptible through immediate experience. They're what you experience. So no such thing as subconscious qualia. If you didn't experience it, then there was nothing for you to experience. You didn't experience the quality of that mental content. So these are the felt experiences, the things that you experience, and therefore they are taken as real. There is a reality to them. And as we say, we actually know of nothing else that we could establish as being as real, because everything else that we believe exists and is real has been given to us or conveyed to us through the experiences which contain qualia. So just to quote Professor Michael Tai, who was the compiler of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on consciousness and qualia, he says, "Your own experience of them at this and every moment should be enough to establish their actuality. In this sense, it is difficult to deny that there are qualia." And he makes that point because a number of philosophers think that they will get round and provide an explanation of consciousness by denying that qualia really exist. And that is now considered to be, as Srila Prabhupada would say, a fool's errand. So qualia are real, but they're not necessarily accurate. And we're going to show a few kind of illusions in different times during this presentation. But here's one. There's a red line and a blue line in this diagram. Which is longer? We could take a poll, but probably your eye is telling you that the red one is longer than the blue one. But of course, they're the same length. That's just the way it is. So we may experience illusions, we may be tricked by our senses, whether it's our eyes, our ears, touch, taste. We can be fooled in terms of what we are understanding through our experiences. But the qualia themselves are real. Now, so real and phenomenal. And the next one are that they are subjective and private. So, what that means is that they are internal to us. They're what we are experiencing. And it's very hard for us to communicate and to understand what others are experiencing. I cannot say what your qualia are. You may try and explain it to me. We may converse and I might get an idea of what you're thinking or seeing. But they're subjective. And one of the best examples that highlights the nature of the subjectivity is this thing the phenomenon that nearly broke the internet a few years back. It's that dress. I don't know if some of you remember it, but again, we've got a little poll going on this one. Those who can, access the Facebook and tell me, what colours do you see the dress? You've got 3 choices: black and blue, white and gold, or other. So take a moment to do that. So that's the subjective experience. Now, it's much more fun doing that in a live audience. And I've had situations where the audience almost turns on each other. There's a YouTube, the TEDx talk that I did available on YouTube, shows that when we did this in the audience at the University of East Anglia, they nearly started murdering each other. We had to tell them all to keep calm because the debate got so hard between those who see this dress as white and gold, as I do, and others who see it as black and blue. Now, the real dress was black and blue, but that's not the point. The way this photograph is taken in a certain light is now being read differently by different people. So we're each getting exactly the same data into our eyes and into our brains, but the qualia experience of the colors is different. And that's interesting. So there is a difference between what we experience and what the actuality is. And there's a difference between what I experience and what someone else might experience. And therefore, this raises the whole conundrum: is the red that I see the same as the red that you see? And we actually don't know. So they are ineffable and indescribable. And on this point of the redness that I see, try this as an experiment. Could you explain what it is like to experience redness to someone who has never seen color? Someone who, say, is monochromatic, or visitor from outer space, or whatever. How would you describe your experience of redness? Now, the only way we would ever try and do that is by pointing to something and saying, oh, it's red like that thing over there. But that actually doesn't help, because that thing over there may appear red to me, but that doesn't convey anything to anyone else. So it's noted that the qualities of my mental experience are ineffable, indescribable. And we can only try and convey by using some kind of description, or by using what are called cooked terms. And where we might say, if we were describing pain, we might describe it as a dull, thudding pain. Dull and thudding actually have got nothing to do with pain in one sense. They're descriptions of sensation, but we're using them. Or we say it's sharp, or it's tingling. You know, we try and use words, but that doesn't actually convey exactly the emotions we're having. But they're not bad for communication terms. We can give an idea. So, qualia are not identical to their stimuli, meaning that, and this is an important factor, that the physical input that comes into our senses is being processed, partly by the brain, but there seems to be some other layer of processing that is taking what should be standard within the brain and twisting it in some way and producing something that is different to what the brain says it's got. And here's a few examples. This one is Adelson's checkerboard. And I want you to look at A and B. They're part of the checkerboard. They're different shades of grey, aren't they? And they certainly look like that. They really do look like they're different. But when you close everything else, they are the same. So exactly the same shade of colour is represented in the light coming from square A and square B, coming into our brains. But our mind is not accepting that. Our mind wants to give us a picture which is different to what the reality is. So we go back. And even though you now know absolutely that those colours are the same, when we go back, your mind still wants to tell you that they're different. Here's another one. A and B again. Same or different? Oh, don't know why that's there. But they're absolutely the same. And you can do it in colour. The colour of these two dogs. Same or different? Actually, remove all the background, they're the same. Now you might say, well, that's all because of the background. Yeah, but the brain just gets all that. Why is there this overlay that my experience of it is different? That becomes the question. Here's one of my favourites. Here's 12 balls just floating in space there. And how many of them are the same? Go around and count them. How many of them are identical colours? And you kind of think, well, this looks like 4 greens, 4 reds, and 4 sort of browny types. But actually, they're all identical. You can look up that on your own. And then we have other types of illusions, like this one. We look at these things and our brain can, and the impression that we're getting is these lines aren't parallel. They are going at a funny angle to one another. Yet when you draw lines on them, you actually see that they are indeed parallel. Or this one, similar effect. This is just a jumble to our mind. So what we're experiencing as the shape, the qualia shapes in this, is different to the actual reality when they're all the same, when they're parallel like this. Similarly, certain illusions produce a sense of movement. Now, part of that, of course, we know how to construct these illusions, but that doesn't mean we can explain why the qualia aspect differs from the mind. And these are just to give you just to help us meditate on the fact that our internal perception of pictures, of colors and shapes is not the same as external reality. And it is not the same as what's going on in our brain. Here's another one showing kind of movement. And when you see it in quite a large scale, you can start to feel rather seasick. We'll move on. Here's one of my favorites. This is the Hermann grid. Now, when you look at this, I see them, and I wonder if you do too, that in the intersections of all the grids, where there's the white dots, you see them when you look at the middle one, that seems to be white, but all the other ones seem to have infill of some kind of grey. So if you move your eye around, then all the others start to have grey as an input, as an infill. So we're actually seeing something that doesn't exist in the original drawing, and which your brain actually has no information of either. Your brain does not have information that says there should be a grey fill-in on those points. But our experience of it is such. Now, these are just examples just to help us start meditating on the big issue here. That we have, that our internal experiences are different from the external properties. Now, there is a relationship between the two. Of course there is. Our experience is stimulated by sensory input, but it is not identical to it. And that's the vital aspect that we're trying to deal with. So we've come to realize that qualia may be novel qualities, not related at all to anything physical. So here's a couple of other ways of exploring this. These are what's called bistable percepts. And I'm going to show you a couple of the standard versions. The two faces, so look at it, you see there's two faces looking at one another. And when you're looking at that, you cannot see the vase. But when you focus on the white bit, you see, there's a vase there, and you're not seeing the two faces. You can switch back and forth very, very quickly, but you can't experience them, that image, either as a vase or two faces at the same time. And that's interesting, because obviously your brain has the same data, but the experience of it is different. There is a difference between experiencing a white vase and experiencing two faces looking at each other. Similarly with this one, it's the old, this one goes way back, the duck and the rabbit. Again, you can't see them both at the same time. You've got to kind of think, oh, that's a duck. No, I can see the rabbit now. Now I'm looking at. So you go back and forwards. And here's another one done very cleverly with photography. Are you seeing the face front on, or are you seeing a profile? So this is just to kind of give you an idea that actually qualia are internal qualities. Now, they may relate to some properties on the outside, but the properties that we're experiencing internally, we don't know how they exist on the outside world. And I'm going to give you just one example in the short time that we have today, and that is colour. Now, you might think that's a surprise, because surely we understand colour. Here is the chart, here's the spectrum that we all learn in school, and we know, we're told that light has different frequencies and different wavelengths, and depending on the frequency stroke wavelength, the light has a particular colour. But no, light does not have a colour, and that's what I'm about to show you. Now, Sir Isaac Newton was one of the first to explore prisms and the spectrum of light, so you've got to give him some credit. And he raised the question, okay, he was looking at the spectrum and all the pretty colours that we have of the rainbow, and he raised the question then, where's magenta? If every wavelength is meant to be a particular colour, then which wavelength is magenta? And of course, there is no specific single wavelength that relates to the magenta colour. We know magenta is seen by us when there are two other colours, light colours, and these are colours of light, blue and red. So often in classes, I've got my kind of different blue and red pointers, and I'm able to kind of little torches, and they kind of show the overlap between the red and the blue, and there's magenta. Ah, now we've explained. So it's just a mixing of colours. Oh, wait a minute. Now you've got to ask, where does the colour mix? Because you cannot mix two wavelengths and get a new single wavelength. That's not how physics works. So the light waves aren't being mixed. And neither is it happening in the eye, because the red colour will set off particular cones which are tuned to a range which is sensitive to that frequency and wavelength. And light from a different part of the spectrum will set off other cones which are sensitive to that part of the spectrum. So light from the blue part of the spectrum, and that's all we'll call it, and light from what we call the red part of the thing, are setting off different cones in the retina and sending individual discrete messages back to the brain. So there is no mixing of the colour within the eye. And even when it gets to the brain, what we have is that some neurons are firing because they've had a stimulus from one particular cone, and some are coming from another cone. So where's the mixing? Okay, if one neuron says, well, I've got something which I got from this wavelength and you've got something that comes from another wavelength, we're now going to generate the colour purple or magenta. How do they do that? We don't even know how any single neuron can generate your experience of colour, because all that's happening in a neuron is a little charged ion is jumping from one neuron to another. There's no colour in that. So there's no mixing of the colour in the brain. But we experience it. So something is reading the data and allowing the colours to be mixed. And this is very much like what's happening in your television set. We now have televisions, which present 1 million or something colours to us. But actually, all of them work by sending 3 colours: red, green and blue, and allowing our minds to mix them in a particular way. Now, here's one little experiment you can do. But only do this if there's no sensitivity for your eyes. Because what I'd like you to do is to cover your eyes very firmly with your hands so that no light is getting in. And be careful, be firm but be gentle, and if you can, and it's not going to cause you any problems, you can press on your eyeballs just a little, just enough so that actually you start to see colours appearing. maybe greens and blues first, and then maybe reds, and maybe some yellows. That's enough, probably. I don't want to get into any trouble on this one. So, you've been experiencing colour, but no light was involved. How is that? You managed, by pressing on your eyeballs, you're obviously stimulating the cones to send messages up to the brain, but no light was involved. But you experience colour. So colour is a property of our mind, not necessarily of the outside world. Now, I'm not saying there's no colour out there, but what we experience as colour is an internal property. So, qualia, just to sum up so far: real, phenomenal; subjective and private; ineffable, indescribable; not identical to their stimuli. They're related to, but they're not identical to their stimuli. And they're internal properties of our mind. They're what we experience in our mind. Qualia are not the external properties. I'm not saying there are not other external properties which give rise to the experience that we have, but the qualia are the internal ones, not the external ones. Now, this is a very quick summary of the tour of qualia, but just a little poll on this one. If you could look at the Facebook page, it's just asking how many of these did we seem to be able to get across in this particular description. And if, of course, if some aren't fully clear, we may be able to explore them in the Q&A, which is to follow. So take a moment just to say, well, none, some, most, or all. But there's one more, and that is that qualia are irreducible to physical properties. Now, this is a big one, and we're going to explore this much more fully in the next session. But it is characterized by this thought experiment by Professor Jackson. He came up with the story that there was this baby girl, Mary, and her parents were highly driven neuroscientists. So they wanted to do an experiment, and they were going to use their poor daughter as a guinea pig. So they put her in a room which was entirely white and black. They didn't allow her any colouring. They made sure that even her skin was covered. They only fed her white foods. But she was a brilliant intellect and became the world's leading authority on visual experience. She read up all the biology, all the neuroscience, all the philosophy, all the psychology. She knew everything there was to know about how the senses processed information about the world. But then one day, she managed to escape from this room. She went out into the world, and there she saw the sky, the trees and the flowers and everything that was going on. So for the first time, she was actually experiencing what it is like to undergo the experience of colour. And the question is this something new for her? Sometimes it's phrased as, did she get any new knowledge about what it is like to experience the colour red? She knew the physiology of it, she knew the science of it, but did the actual experience of it add to her knowledge? And that is sometimes argued. But certainly, did she experience something new and different and additional to whatever she had experienced in the past? Is the experience of colour, when it's actually experienced directly and internally, something more than could ever be understood from all the physics and all the biology of it? That was the question that was raised. So, poor Mary, after discovering how beautiful and colourful the world is, she then decided to report her parents to social services, and after loads and loads of therapy, she lived happily ever after. So, we're pleased that it turned out okay for her. So, qualia are properties that we experience within our mind. They are an interpretation of brain data, but are distinct and inexplicable in terms of brain capability. And this will be the subject that we will go on next week. I will really have to show you and prove that point, that qualia are distinct and inexplicable in terms of brain capability. So, some years back, New Scientist did this as a headline. Science contains many hard questions, but only one problem within science gets to call itself the hard problem: consciousness. And as David Chalmers said, the hard problem is how physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experience. And back to Michael Tai. For many on both sides of the argument, qualia are seen to represent the de facto proof that conscious perception must be non-neural. That's how powerful this concept of qualia are. That actually, for many on both sides of the argument, qualia are the de facto proof that conscious perception must be non-neural. So what I'm suggesting is that even if you don't think I've done a very good job trying to explain how amazing and special qualia are and how they establish the hard problem of consciousness, I'm asking you to take some authority from those who are exploring consciousness at the rock face of scientific and philosophical research. And because qualia are so powerful in defeating the idea that conscious perception can be explained in reference to the brain, they are under so much attack. And we'll have to look at some of the issues a little later in this course where people are trying to challenge the nature of qualia. But what we've seen is that qualia are real, they are what we experience, and if we haven't really appreciated how important they are, then I would ask you, please, you have to reflect that the only thing that you are experiencing ever are qualia. What your mind, the information your mind has got and how it presents that to you about what the rest of the world is like. Now, some devotees sometimes ask, well, what about qualia and the Vedas? Because obviously qualia, as I explained, although it's a Latin term, it's a modern concept and it's born out of psychology and neuroscience. So do they relate to Vedic concepts? And yes, they do, but I will give, when we're exploring the nature of the mind and the interaction between consciousness and the brain, I'll give a much more detailed description of a particular concept that is provided within Sankhya and the Yoga Sutras called pratyaya. Pratyaya is the impression that you get from any sensory input, such as the picture that you're getting when you look out of the world. And qualia simply refer to the qualities, the shapes and colours that you are experiencing within that pratyaya. So qualia are linked to the Vedic concepts. And of course, it's also mentioned in the Gita. Krishna says, I am the taste of water. He says, I am the original fragrance of the earth. Now, what Krishna is actually pointing out is a deeper metaphysical truth about the nature of matter and how it links to consciousness. But he's doing so in a way that's asking us to meditate on the experience that we're having, the qualia experience. When we drink water, there is a taste, there is something that it is like to experience that wonderful taste of water. When we smell the fragrance of the earth, there is something that is like to have that fragrance in our minds. So Krishna is using the concept of qualia as a way in to experience the metaphysics that is described in the Bhagavad Gita and the other Vedic scriptures. So we're going to have a little Q&A at the moment, but we're going to do this as a new experiment. We're just starting a Zoom call, and the number is there. You can see it on the screen, 842-8423-1643. And if you would like to take part in this discussion, join us on this right away. There's no password needed. Just you can either use the web link, or if you have Zoom, as many folk do have in these troubled times, then you can use that and join. It's free, it doesn't cost you anything, and we'll be able to have a good old chat if you'd like to join us then. But thank you very much. Otherwise, we've given our summary that qualia are real. They're the qualities of all our inner experiences. They defy all attempts to reduce them to physics of the brain. And that's a statement for now. I've given some hint on that, but we'll establish more on that next week. Hence, qualia are the unanswered question of consciousness. They represent the hard problem. So I see some folk are starting to join in on the Zoom call, and hope you can join us. But otherwise, next week our class will be brain failure. Why the brain cannot account for consciousness. And actually, you'll be very surprised how little it can account for. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing you should look after, but it's not doing everything that is claimed for it. So looking forward to join you on the Zoom call just now. Thank you very much.